So I probably don't actually need this microphone to talk in this small group, but it is being recorded, so I guess I'll use it. Thank you to Step Up Silicon Valley, Greg and Almaz, for inviting me for this talk. We've actually been talking about this talk for 6 months now, so it's nice to actually realize it, and to Santa Clara University for hosting it and co-sponsoring it and inviting me here. I'm going to do 3 things this morning in about 40 minutes or so, and hopefully open it up to some discussion, really, and questions and answers. But you should also feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have some questions about what I'm presenting. And so the 3 things I'm going to do this morning, one is talk a bit about our overall economic context, and what I see is kind of 3 dimensions of our current economic crisis, and I really use that term advisedly. I think we are in a long-term crisis. Then I'll talk a bit about some of the research that's in this book with Manuel Pastor, and we're actually doing some subsequent research on similar topics, just finalizing another book manuscript. So I'll tell you a bit about some of the research from that, and then finish with some of our preliminary kind of conclusions from that new research about Silicon Valley, because it's one of the places that we've come back and looked at as part of this research on the relationship between equity and growth. My PhD dissertation was all about labor markets in Silicon Valley in the mid-90s, which was a very interesting time to be in Silicon Valley, the launch of the World Wide Web and all. That was a book called Work in the New Economy, so it's been kind of fun to come back and kind of revisit what's going on in labor markets here some 20 years later. So in terms of our general economic situation, most people are quite familiar with our jobs crisis. We have been out of recession now since the middle of 2009, more than 4 years. And this graph, which shows our overall gross domestic product, is now above where we were before the economic crisis of 2008 hit. But of course, our jobs are not back to where they were before the recession hit. Estimates are now somewhere mid-2014, we might get back to the same number of jobs that we had prior to the recession, but that still doesn't deal with the growth in the labor force. So we still have a number of years to get back just to where we were before the recession hit. This is pretty widely understood and talked about in the mainstream media and policy circles. What's not as well understood is the longer-term, deeper job crisis. What I'm going to show here is once recovery starts post-recession, for every recession starting in 1961, as soon as economic growth starts, job growth started as well. Except starting in 1990, we had a period of about 3 years of jobless growth. The 2000 recovery nationally, even longer period of jobless growth. And then this is our most recent recession of recovery. So what we have going on is this experience where companies in the economy are able to grow without creating jobs. And you can imagine what are the things that happened in roughly 89, 90? Well, it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening up of the Soviet Union. China starts opening up at these times. These processes of globalization become increasingly integrated. Of course, the internet, rapid expansion of World Wide Web, technological change going on at this time, a whole system of rapid economic restructuring that's changing to a certain extent this relationship between growth and job creation. But it's actually a deeper problem than that, because it's not just a jobs crisis, it's an economic growth crisis. In the 1950s and 60s, we used to average about 4% growth in GDP per year. Started to decline in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, where we were lucky to average about 3% a year. In the 2000s and 2010s, we're closer to 1.5% to 2% a year. So in the midst of this economic restructuring with increased competition, rapid technological change, and all the issues that are going along with that, we have a major problem in dealing with our economic situation. So that's the first dimension of the crisis. It's an economic and jobs crisis. Yes?
The GDP growth rate goes down, I wonder because just the basis goes higher. We see this trend all over the world, right? When the basis is higher, the growth rate goes down. So is this a problem per se, or it's just normal?
we definitely have an economic growth problem. The factors that are shaping this, I don't know. The question was whether this would be normal as our size of GDP goes higher, the percentage rate might go down. There's issues about population growth in here as an aging baby boom. My point is not to look at the causes of this, but that this is a factor of more stagnant growth, which has lots of implications, because if you're growing faster, it's easier to redistribute, it's easier to ensure broad prosperity. But the second dimension of this crisis is a growing inequality crisis. And there's many dimensions of this. My favorite graph is probably many of you have seen this, from Emmanuel Size and Thomas Piketty, looking at data from the Internal Revenue Service on tax receipts, which is one of the few sources of data where you can actually look at income at the very top levels of income earners in the country. And what this will show is that the share of total US income going to the top percent of income earners going back to 1917 hit a peak just before the Great Depression. Then we had a period during that time of great economic growth in the 50s and 60s when we had relatively equal income distribution. Started accelerating again inequality in the 70s to reach another peak in 2008. And we think this inequality is a key part of what drove the economic crisis of 2008, because you have a process of increasing numbers of the US population having to stretch further and further, going deeper and deeper into debt to maintain the American dream. And you have a concentration of wealth at the top that are increasingly looking for new and additional investments, and part of that fueling of the mortgage-backed securities crisis that resulted in that. So a crisis of economic growth and job creation, and a crisis of inequality in this country. So at the time that we really need visionary, foresighted, national level leadership to pull us out of this crisis, what do we have in Washington? And not a whole lot of confidence in Congress. My favorite poll on this was where people were asked to compare a whole series of unpleasant things in comparison to Congress. Congress lost out to lice, colonoscopies, root canals, Nickelback. Fortunately, schoolyard bullies, telemarketers managed to beat out Congress, so they're still doing okay. But anyway, there are some other indicators of problems at a national level that are longer term. The number of bills passed by Congress has been going down per sessions. That's from the 1940s onwards. One of the measures of partisanship, a party unity score, has increased over time since the 1970s. People typically look at that problem of partisanship in Congress as being deeply rooted in the post-2010 gerrymandering of congressional districts, creating safe districts for Tea Party members and Republican members, and to a certain extent Democratic Party on the other side. And so that people are more concerned about a challenge from the far right or the far left in a primary rather than serving the population as a whole. But that hides a deeper process of spatial sorting going on in the United States, where we were moving by income, by ideology, to different areas. And there's a couple of different measures I want to show of that. One is looking at a county basis. The number of people living in counties where either a Democratic or a Republican presidential candidate wins by a landslide, 20% or more. In 1992, it was only about a quarter of voters lived in a county where the presidential candidate won by a landslide. By 2012, it was half. On a longer term trend, if you look at the median income of families in the neighborhood of residents, the percentage of the population that has lived in either extremely poor neighborhoods or extremely affluent neighborhoods has doubled over a 30-year period as well. Again, as we're spatially sorting into different neighborhoods and exposed to fewer people from diverse backgrounds by ideology and by income at least. Racial segregation is a little different story. Things are doing better there. But I think part of that spatial segregation has to do with a very fragmentation in the knowledge base by which we understand what's going on in society. This came out in the presidential elections last fall at Time magazine's, who's telling the truth. There are kind of extreme examples of this. The national poll that found that a third of all Republicans believe that President Obama is Muslim, and the survey of actually a third of all Americans who believed in the mid-2000s that the federal government was complicit in the 9/11 bombings as an excuse for invading Iraq. So we get some of that extremes on both ends of the political spectrum. But more broadly, I think what's going on is a fragmentation in the very source of information we get about what's going on in our society. That top graph is the percentage of the population by age group that reads a newspaper on a weekly basis. That's either online or in paper. We're down to less than a third of the population under 35 that read a newspaper. And you think historically the role newspapers have played as at least a broad source of information. They call it the fourth estate, really critical part of ensuring democracy in our society as a watchdog of what's going on. Where are people getting their information? Well, of course, increasingly it's customized news sources on the internet, blogs, internet sites, some of our own custom radio shows or television shows, and some of us will listen to NPR and read the New York Times perhaps. Some of us will watch Fox News and get our news from the Tea Party Patriots. But increasingly that sorting of information is happening through automated algorithms. So Google, Facebook, in particular, customize information to the preferences that are expressed by people and what they're looking for. So we're actually filtering out information that isn't in line with our broad interests and beliefs. So jobs crisis and economic crisis, growing inequality, and a lack of political leadership that at least in some way is rooted in a fragmentation of the very knowledge base of what's going on in our society. Three dimensions of our current crisis. Now, I'm actually not here to depress you on a rainy Tuesday morning. I actually want to present solutions. And we think that some important lessons about solutions to this crisis emerge from regions throughout the country that have been successful over a long period of time, 20, 30 years, in creating not just growth, but in creating just growth. That is economic growth and social inclusion going hand in hand. And let me tell you a story about one of those places we looked at in the book, Jacksonville, Florida. In the 1960s, tremendously divided society, racial conflict, civil rights activists were trying to integrate the lunch counters in Jacksonville like their compatriots in Greensboro, which got much more famous. This is what political dialogue looks like in Jacksonville in the 1960s. There was a very famous incident called Axe Handle Saturday, where white segregationists handed out axe handles to people who were then beating up the civil rights protesters. The city police at the time refused to intervene to protect the civil rights protesters until the protesters then grabbed the axe handles themselves and started defending themselves. Then the police intervened. The mayor at the time, who was an avowed segregationist, praised the police for their work and basically lied on national radio about what was going on. It's interesting, there's very little information about this event and very little footage, either photographs or video footage of this time. It's kind of almost been wiped from the history of Jacksonville, but a very important part of its history in the 1960s. Well, what happened after that? Well, one of the things that happened is the population of Jacksonville got rid of their city government. Wasn't quite the city government. They merged the city government with the surrounding county government to create what is still the largest city by land area in the lower 48 states. Now, why is this important? Well, at a time when in much of U.S. metropolitan regions we have white flight, growing suburbanization, improving tax base in the suburbs, and a vicious cycle of decreasing tax base, growing poverty, worsening schools in the central city, well, in Jacksonville, that's all one tax base in one region and one school district that can be planned for on a single basis. So integrating what had been diverse constituencies in many other regions. The other thing, and that happened in the late 1960s, 67 or so. Then in the early 1970s, actually out of an initiative, the Chamber of Commerce created a nonprofit organization called the Jacksonville Community Council. This organization provides indicators of what's going on in Jacksonville, quite similar actually to Joint Ventures Index of Silicon Valley, but started in the 1970s, important base of knowledge of what's going on. But the other thing they do is create community councils. Now these are groups of 20 to 25 people selected deliberately to represent diversity of the population of the region by income, by race, by ideology. And they are tasked on a year-long process of investigating a single issue or problem in the region. Could be high school dropout rates, could be addressing poverty issues, could be growing green jobs or redevelopment at the airport or growing transportation systems. What's critical about this, they go through every week meeting for 3 hours, meeting with stakeholders, resource people, political leaders, researchers, getting a sense of what the problems are, and they come up with a set of recommendations for solutions. What's critical is these solutions are come about not through voting, but through consensus. And in that process, they have to come to terms with the different perspectives of everyone in the region, and everyone that's part of that process, to figure out how do we come up with a solution that represents, at least on some level, everyone's interest in that process. Now, what's going on in Jacksonville during this time? Well, between 1980 and 2000, the core period of the Just Growth book, Jacksonville grew twice as fast as the average metropolitan region in the country and reduced inequality and poverty at a time when it was increasing on average in most metropolitan regions. So it's one example of one of these Just Growth regions. Before going more into the research that was part of the book, I want to step back a bit and put it a little bit in context of kind of the research that we're building on. In your introductory economics course in college, those of us who've had the fortune or perhaps misfortune of having taken undergraduate economics courses, learned that often inequality and growth are seen as not necessarily incompatible, but often going in different directions. And if you intervene in the market to promote social goods, you'll be reducing efficiency. So you have these trade-offs between equity and efficiency. And some of the arguments are that, well, you need a certain level of inequality to promote incentives and motivation. You need certain concentrations of capital for large-scale investments in new capital equipment, new factories, new technologies. In some cases, it's simply seen as a byproduct of shifting from low to high productivity sectors, and some of those sectors of the population that have outdated skills have lower returns in the labor market, and those in those cutting-edge industries have much higher. What's interesting, though, is that there's a growing body of research documenting that at least at some levels of inequality, inequalities actually decreasing growth or associated with lower growth. Now, to a certain extent, that's been part of Keynesian economics since it emerged in the 30s and 40s, where the national government's role in ensuring effective demand through social welfare programs and various things is critically important part of ensuring growth over time. But what's interesting about these new research, some of it coming from such, liberal economic organizations as the International Monetary Fund, find that what's happening in the global south is that those countries that are more equitable over a 50-year time period have actually grown faster. And it has to do with a series of factors related to political conflict and confidence in institutions and the relationship between social equity and outside investment and growth over time. And in the United States, this evidence has been emerging of the relationship between growth and equity at a regional scale, really emerging since the 1990s, early 1990s. And almost no matter how you look at inequality, whether it's the relationship between income in the central city versus suburbs, or looking at poverty gaps and segregation, looking at measures of racial inclusion and income equality, a whole variety of things, those regions that are more equitable grow faster. There's a strong statistical relationship. Again, some of the strongest work in this area is from that other well-known liberal think tank, the Federal Reserve, in this case in Cleveland, who has been looking at measures in 136 different metropolitan areas, 4 measures of growth, per capita income, employment growth, metropolitan product productivity, looking at 38 different variables that might be associated with that growth, clustering it in 9 different broad indicators and things that we might expect, like skilled workforce, technology commercialization, business dynamics, individual entrepreneurship. the factor that's most consistently related with all measures of economic growth is their measure of racial inclusion and income equality. So there's quite a bit of evidence that they go together. What's relatively new research is how and why. How is it that regions that are more equitable are able to build that linkage between growth and equity? And what are the relationships and why do they exist? So that's really what our book was trying to contribute to, is understanding the mechanisms and the processes of doing that. And so the steps really require, to do that study, 3 different steps for the research. The first is we got to identify those regions that have been successful in promoting growth and equity together. Then we can do some quantitative analysis of looking at, like this, a set of structural features that might help explain that outcome. But then we really wanted to do case studies and in-depth research and talking to people about what's going on in those regions to try and understand those mechanisms. So that first step of identifying just growth regions, we looked at a variety of different measures of growth, including change in earnings per job, change in employment, change in per capita income, median household income, and a variety of measures of equity. And really, after looking at those, decided that the best measures had to do with these 2 in economic growth. So it's the change in total jobs, because that's broadly what we're interested in terms of economic opportunity. And then the change in earnings per job, because it doesn't do us any good to create a lot of low-wage jobs. We want to be creating better and better jobs over time. And then in terms of the inequality measures, we looked at the 80-20 household income ratio, so the ratio of income to households at the top to the bottom of the income distribution, but also looking at the percentage of people in poverty. Because it really doesn't do us much good to reduce inequality if more people are getting poor. We want to raise all boats and move up over time while promoting greater equity. So we ended up developing an index of growth and an index of equity out of the 2 different indicators in each case over 3 time periods. One was the 80s, one was the 90s, one was looking at that overall 20-year period because we didn't want to have one decade drive one more than the other. In our current research, we've updated this to 2010. In each case, we're looking at the top third of regions that are in the equity index and the top third that are in the growth index that are that best box. That's where you really want to be. And that's what the map looks like. We're comparing regions, metropolitan regions, within the broad census region of the country. So you're comparing regions in the south just to other regions in the south and the west, Midwest, because you don't want to compare older industrial manufacturing regions with what's going on in the southwest. So a couple things to notice here. Silicon Valley, both in the figure up to 2000 to 2010, is in that in that category of high economic growth, but low equity. So the worst category of inequality. I'll come back to that over time. We ended up doing a comparison in our current research of 3 regions in North Carolina and 3 regions in California. In each case, one region that was a just growth region, so Sacramento in California and Raleigh in North Carolina, which is kind of interesting because it's another high-tech influence region. A region that was just the opposite in that red category, which is Fresno in California and Greensboro in North Carolina. And then a region which has a reputation for strong levels of collaboration, knowledge sharing, information flow within the region, and yet that hasn't translated into growth and equity, because we're trying to understand what's happening with diverse constituencies in the region. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second why. And so that's Silicon Valley and Charlotte, North Carolina. So the structural part of the analysis, we looked at a variety of different indicators around employment, industrial composition, how many people in high-tech industries, construction, manufacturing, et cetera. Set of geographical and distributional dimensions, workforce demographics, some interest in regional growth or justice, a variety of simple correlations, some multivariate regressions and Logent models. People could ask me about the specifics of that. But what I want to sort of share in terms of some of the broad characteristics emerge partially from that quantitative analysis and partly from the case study research. So it turns out that being a state capital is probably your best economic development strategy. So Silicon Valley should become a state capital. It's a little hard to push that as an economic development strategy, obviously. But it turns out that places that are state capitals tend to be both above average economic growth and above average improvement in equity. And part of that, we think, is because the public sector can be a counter-cyclical force in the broader economy, sort of balancing out the ups and downs of the private sector. It was true that public sector employment also was a key part of explaining trends in Jacksonville, which has a lot of Navy employment, a lot of military employment in shipyards. And then Sacramento was a case where, in our first study, it did very well in the 80s, actually did very poorly in the 90s, and then has recovered a bit in 2010. And what explains that very poor performance in the 90s was the closure of 3 military bases in Sacramento during the base closure process. Anyway, the key point about this is that the public sector is often seen as a draw away from the economy, right? So you've got the economy there, you can take some taxes out to support public goods, but that's not part of the economy. In fact, the public sector is a critical part of regional economies. It's an important employment sector, an important basis of demand in the regional economy, but it's also an important investment in schools. Large, public universities is a big part of that, public employment, K through 12 schools, et cetera. And the public sector, of course, plays a critical role in ensuring our infrastructure around transportation systems, movement of goods, healthcare, which is really important for the productivity of the workforce. So the public sector is a critical part of that economic growth. Public sector was also really important in explaining some of the dynamics in Denver and perhaps other places where it had very poor economic growth and growing inequality in the 80s, but managed to turn it around in the 1990s with strong public sector investment in what was essentially public works programs. So major new stadium for the Denver Broncos, major new airport, Denver International Airport. A lot of this was public-private investment, a new convention center. They've continued that public investment with a large-scale light rail system. So that's been an important part of explaining Denver as part of that. We had a couple different measures of education. One was looking at the percentage of population with a bachelor's degree or higher. And then we're also looking at the percentage of population that had at least graduated from high school. And it turns out both are broadly correlated with both growth and to a certain extent equity. But it's that measure of the population that's managed to get through high school that was more closely related to both growth and equity. So one of the policy implications is that, well, sure, we should be paying a lot of attention to getting people into 4-year degrees and bachelor's degrees, but we should really be paying a lot of attention to make sure we're reducing our high school dropout rate, because that's a real drag on economic growth. We had some measures in there of the percentage of the African American and Latino populations that were in middle income brackets in the region. That turned out to be very strongly correlated with growth and equity, and in our case study interviews, turned out that what people were saying is that that was a very important bridge building population. So a group of people that had emerged into business leadership and private sector leadership, in many cases often in professional occupations, but had connections and a history with disadvantaged part of the populations and being able to be a bridge builder between those sectors of the region. We had some indicators looking at housing and the relationship of access to housing and both economic growth and social equity. The only consistent measure, we had a couple different measures having to do with spatial segregation by income and by race. And it turns out that those regions that have both greater integration by race and income across the region have both higher growth and higher equity dynamics. It's kind of interesting, this percentage of home ownership rate does contribute to greater equity, or at least is related to greater equity, but is actually associated with slower growth. And there's some more recent research amongst economists that are looking at the ways that that ties to homes makes it harder for labor markets to adjust, essentially, harder for people to take advantage of new employment opportunities that may exist either in other regions or other part of the region in which they live, because it limits their search capabilities over time. I think it's interesting work going forward. I mentioned Jacksonville being a regional economy and having most of its jobs now within the single regional city. It turns out the ratio of principal city employment to suburban employment was an important indicator. Nashville is another region that was a merged city-county that also had a high concentration of its jobs in the central city. Cleveland, which was kind of the opposite dynamics, is one of the worst regions in terms of most of the jobs having fled to the suburbs and creating this big division between them. But you don't have to have a regional government to be a just growth region. Now it does help, and some of the regions that we're looking at in our current round surprised us because they emerged in some of these dynamics in ways that we didn't know, and we didn't know they had a regional government. So Oklahoma City is one of those places which had a very terrible economy and growing inequality in the 80s and early 90s. But starting in 1992, we have what has now become 4 successive Republican mayoral administrations, mayors, and a very conservative, well, state overall. It's the only state in the country where every county voted Republican for the presidential candidate in both 2008 and 2012, and they're very proud of that fact. They told us when we visited. But the Chamber of Commerce there has been a big leader in pushing for increased taxes for major public sector investment in a variety of public infrastructure projects. This started, it's called MAPS, the Metropolitan Area Project, something, I forget what the S is. Started out in 1992 with an integrated 9 major project initiative. It included a downtown arena that became the home of the Oklahoma City Thunder. It included some efforts to redevelop what's now the Oklahoma River. It had been called the river that you had to mow because it was so grown up with grass, and they turned it into a beautiful open walking space. A new major public library, investment in transit systems. And what's interesting is that the way this was sold to the electorate was this sense of you have to have all these projects integrated going together. So there was an arts project, and if you're interested in the symphony, are you really going to give up our investment in the symphony because you don't like baseball and don't want us to build that minor league baseball stadium? So it's about helping people understand the connections between them. And part of what drives that, we think, is that Oklahoma City got to a regional government through a different process, essentially through a process of annexation. So in 1950, the city of Oklahoma City was only 50 square miles. 10 years later, it was 650 square miles. It had grown by that much and annexing adjacent lands. One of the programs that is part of this increased taxes is investment in education. So they've passed the increased sales tax that is investing $750 million in school redevelopment throughout the metropolitan region. It's actually 27 different school districts that are now supported by this generalized tax in the area. And again, the economy of Oklahoma City, for a variety of different reasons, but we think this is partially contributing to it, has turned around in the last 15 years, and equity hasn't gotten as bad as the rest of the country. But Kansas City is a case where they don't have a regional government. The region is a pretty complex place. It's by state, so both Kansas and Missouri. 9 counties, 160 odd different municipalities. But they have come together in what's called the Mid-America Regional Council. It's a metropolitan planning organization that every region in the country has. In most regions in the country, though, they deal just with transportation planning. In some places in the country, like the Bay Area, with the Association of Bay Area Governments and the Metropolitan Transportation Committee, we link land use and transportation planning. But in Kansas City, the Mid-America Regional Council is collaborating across all these jurisdictions on everything from early childhood education to services for the elderly, to environmental services, to emergency services, to economic development and transportation and land use. They even had a Department of International Trade and Investment that they're collaborating with on this. And one of the things they also did was develop a Metro Outlook Live, which is a very sophisticated model of understanding the interconnections between economic growth, our natural ecosystem ingrained there, and our social systems, neighborhoods and communities in red, and the interconnections between all three, and developing indicators to monitor progress in all of those 3 areas over time. And again, been relatively successful in linking economic growth and equity. My final story, and then I'll get into some of the conclusions in Silicon Valley, is Salt Lake City. Now, when I tell the Salt Lake City story, people think, oh, equity and growth go together in Salt Lake City? Well, that's equity for a bunch of white guys, right? Well, it turns out Salt Lake City, over the last 20 years, really, is going through a very rapid demographic transformation with rapid in-migration of mostly Latino immigrants, but also immigrants from other parts of the world. It's going to become a majority-minority region before the country as a whole becomes a majority-minority region. It is now the most equitable metropolitan region in the country and has been able to improve that measure of both economic growth and equity consistently since the 1980s. How has it been able to do that? Well, part of it, of course, must be the role of the Mormon Church. What's interesting to me about that, though, which I hadn't realized, is that the Mormon Church has a lay clergy structure. So it means that the local unit of the church, the bishop, essentially rotates every 3 to 6 years or so. They're all men who are local bishops, and they're often major business leaders in the community, CEOs, corporate executives. One of their jobs in that role of local bishop is to administer a provident fund for the poor that is funded in part from the fact that everyone who's Mormon is supposed to fast 1 day a month and give the money they save from their own food into this provident fund for the poor. And in the ideology of the Mormon Church, you're giving not a hand out, you're giving a hand up. So as a bishop in charge of the social services fund, you're not just distributing it to the poor, you're working in depth with poor families to figure out how do they get connected to the social and economic resources that are going to help them out of poverty. So the point is you have CEOs and business executives that have experience for 5 to 8 years as social workers. Where else do you have that regular connection across those different constituencies? Now, of course, part of the story here, too, is the international connections of the Mormon Church. More than half of Mormons in the world now are outside of the United States. The majority of those are in Latin America. It's a big part of why we're getting increased Latino migration into Utah. And an incredibly, I shouldn't say incredibly, an openness to international immigrants that was surprising to me going there. So driver's license for undocumented immigrants was passed in 1999. In-state tuition for undocumented youth in state university systems since 2004. And the passage here of the Utah Compact, which was a declaration of principles about how we're going to have this discussion about immigrants and the connections to our communities and families in a very principled, open way, respecting the importance of connections between families, passed about 5 years ago. Again, presaging a lot of the national debate about comprehensive immigration reform. Now, part of what's also interesting about Salt Lake City is the work of a nonprofit organization, small little group, Envision Utah, staff of about 3, 4, 5 people, that's done what essentially the Mid-America Regional Council has done through government on a regional planning body, starting in the 1980s in its roots, but really in the 1990s, developing a broad public discussion about where do we want our future to be. Part of it's rooted in the importance of youth and children in the Mormon culture. It's what's the legacy we want to leave to our children. But part of it's about a concern of loss of quality of life and really looking at 20 years down the road. Where do we want housing? Where do we want land use? What are we going to do with our transportation systems? And this has contributed to what is now one of the best transit systems in the country in terms of its measurement between housing and job access. And broad agreement in the region. And we had some interesting interviews with developers in the region who said, if we're talking about a project that's going in the ground tomorrow, you know, we're going to be fighting. If you're the environmentalist concerned about its impact, I'm the developer, we need profits. If you're the labor union, you need the jobs. If there's, concern about equity, that's going to be fighting. But if we're talking about what our community is going to look like 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, we actually have a lot in common, and we can start to see our common destiny as a region in the future going together. So what does all of this mean? Well, if you know anything about academics who've gotten funding to do research, we're supposed to do 2 things, right? We're supposed to say we discovered something new and give it an interesting sounding name. And then we're supposed to say, yeah, but we really need more research to study this in more depth. It's our full employment program, so we've done that. We think part of what's going on here is what we're calling diverse epistemic community. Now, there's quite a bit of literature research on epistemic communities, which have been described as like-minded networks of professionals whose authoritative claim to consensual knowledge provides them with unique sources of power in decision-making processes. Is that obscure enough for you all? I get the extra funding? The essential point about this is that what matters is not what you know, but who you know it with. And that if you have a diverse knowledge base within the region, we think that's an important contributor to both greater economic growth and greater social equity. Now, why should this contribute to greater economic growth? Well, in this period in the US economy where we're going through these tremendous processes of economic restructuring, those places that are successful, we think, are ones that are able to not just identify new growth opportunities. And of course, some of that comes from recognizing the diversity of constituencies and opportunities that are out there. For instance, how many people would have predicted 15 years ago that 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world in that decade would be in Africa? Right? We don't necessarily know where the next growth pole in the global economy is going to come from, where the new technological innovation is going to come from, how that's going to change employment patterns. So if you have a diverse base of knowledge that's constantly innovating and sharing information about what those opportunities are, we think there's more likelihood to identify what that is. But what's critical too is the ability to respond to that. That competitiveness in this new global information economy is rooted not just in individual firms, not just in clusters of related firms in semiconductors or movies or whatever else. Largely in the relationship between those firms and broad sets of suppliers, but also the community colleges, the university systems, the K through 12 colleges that are helping to prepare a workforce to go into those new and growing industries. But also critically, the cultural values and aspirations of youth and people in the labor market about what kind of jobs they want to have. And when those are aligned and connected, we think that that enables regions to respond more quickly to economic change and to grow faster in these new opportunities. I think the connections around equity are probably a little more obvious when you're connecting different racial constituencies, income constituencies, geographic constituencies that allows regions to grow together. So that's the hypothesis and the organizing, and that's what the new book is all about, is really looking specifically at conflict and collaboration across diverse constituencies at a regional level, and how information is shared across those diverse constituencies. So we're looking at 10 new case study regions in the country, doing some more quantitative data work. Silicon Valley is one of the places we looked at. And I want to give you just a few statistics and insights from that research and then really open it up for your feedback and discussion. So one is looking at our just growth indicators of employment, earnings, poverty, and inequality. This is from 1980 to 2010. Silicon Valley is in blue. The other metropolitan regions in the west are in whatever, orange, red, and then green is the US as a whole. Employment over that 30-year period, Silicon Valley is underperforming in job growth for both the US as a whole and other metro regions in the west. Doing much better in growth and earnings, but we'll look a little bit where that's coming from. Underperforming in terms of change in the poverty level. So growth in poverty is higher in Silicon Valley. Now, in some cases, this is because it's starting at a lower base. This comes back to your point. But partially, we think that's because the measure of poverty in Silicon Valley was such high cost of living, is actually perhaps not a very good measure. We should probably start at a higher level. And then inequality, of course, is growing. When you look at overall, this is the cumulative job growth. Up through the 80s and 90s, Silicon Valley was outperforming the US as a whole. But of course, it crashed in 1999 and has never really recovered dramatically since then. It's been pretty flat. So volatile employment. Rapid growth in earnings at the top, at the 80th percentile, the 20th percentile in inflation-adjusted terms, maybe $1,000 more in 2010 than in 1980. This has racial dimensions to it, of course. The higher education levels you have in Silicon Valley, the higher income or hourly wage level overall you see. But what's interesting is in that Latino population, even those Latinos with a bachelor's degree or higher are earning substantially less than any other racial group. And when you look at the employment figures in the high-tech industry in Silicon Valley, overall, the Latino population in Silicon Valley, Santa Clara County, about 25% of the workforce. In high-tech industries, it's about 7%. And many of those are in the lower-end technical positions and support positions, not in higher-end positions. So there's a big problem of racial inequality here. And when you look at overall households by income level, partly what we're seeing is a growth in the bottom third, a shrinking in the middle, but also a shrinking at the top as well. So it's essentially, people talk about the hourglass economy. I actually think of it more as an elongated pear economy that's occurring in many parts of the US and here in Silicon Valley, where the top is shrinking and more people are being pushed down to lower levels in the labor market. And when we look at the last 20 years, at least up to 2010, of job growth by industry, by the average wage level in the industries, we're getting some job growth in those industries that pay low and medium level wages, but an actual decline in industries that have high wages on average, even though earnings in those industries have gone up dramatically. So as part of our comparison with Raleigh and other places in Fresno, in some ways it raises a question of, well, who are the benchmark regions for Silicon Valley? You'd like to think other high-tech regions are the benchmark regions, and Raleigh is outperforming Silicon Valley in employment, not so much in earnings, but certainly a lot better in poverty and inequality. Fresno, our red region, is actually outperforming Silicon Valley over this 30-time-year period in job growth. And actually in inequality also, but doing worse in poverty and earnings. So, the key issues for Silicon Valley that we're talking about in this book, and it's not out yet, so I'd love your feedback and ways we should refine this analysis, that we have this volatile employment with rising inequality and poverty. But then in talking to people and doing interviews, especially compared to the research I was doing here in the mid-90s, we've seen a process of, I think, increased particularly income segregation. And part of it is the way that the increasing global connections and global orientation of the high-tech industry and workers in the high-tech industry, and of course some of it involves migrating up the peninsula and moving into San Francisco and all that, has meant both that there's less of a connection to the disadvantaged sectors of our region, and perhaps less of a concern. I mean, it's hard to compete in this high-tech industry with the rapid change, and so there's a lot of focus out there. And to the extent that there's concern in this constituency about the less fortunate, it seems to emerge in multiple different ways. One is, what about the less fortunate in India or China or Africa or other places? There's tremendous need, so there seems to be a lot of work going out there. There's some investment, of course, in Catholic Charities local and the stuff at Silicon Valley and some of the work of the Community Foundation in this area. But there's some real questions about how much of a commitment I think there is to at least the workforce in high tech to the place. And then in terms of how real is the collaboration across diverse constituencies, I want to leave that up to you. Our sense in talking to people this time was that a lot of people were saying, it's a tale of two valleys. And very different worlds and connections and disconnections going on. So, the final conclusion I want to leave you with is that I think there's a lot of research now, ours and lots of others, about this correlation between equity and growth. I think the research on the causes is still relatively new, and in the book we phrase a lot of our conclusions as hypotheses, preliminary analysis, correlations, not causation. We're really trying to kind of spark a debate about this rather than saying it's definitive. But it seems to be that those regions that are successful in building that sense of long-term mutual destiny together in a collaborative way across multiple constituencies have been more successful. And that's what we think we really need as a country, not just in our regions together. So let me stop there and take your comments. And thank you very much for your attention.